When thinking about blockers, most people miss what's really important. And since that is usually happening in the biggest pots you play, it's costing you the most amount of money. The common way to look at blockers is to see that in cases like this, your jack of spades blocks your opponent's full house combos and therefore makes for a great bluff jam in theory. That's a great way to use the concept of blockers, but not if you stop here. So let's dig deeper. In this 200-400 high stakes hand, Marcos Ladev opens Jack-9 suited and gets called by Linus Love on the button. Well, more like a fan of his. On the flop, the min bet in general is a good strategy as the solver also heavily prefers this size. Marco's combo is mostly not bet here, however we see that a range bet strategy, so betting every hand we have on the flop, would give us the same EV. One reason for the small bet is that both players' ranges are tight and contain a relatively high amount of nut hands, so we don't want to come out blasting off. The button's range also includes few hands that don't hit at least a pair or draw. Only 4-5 suited to 6-7 suited would be pure folds. Pocket 4s to 6s would also fold almost always, while 3s and deuces could continue more often, especially as a raise. Since this flop hits so much of the button's range, choosing bluffs can be difficult on this board. Ace-X is one reasonable candidate, but to be perfectly balanced and still have bluffs on runouts where Ace-X improves, hands like low pocket pairs are chosen as additional bluffs by the solver. So why would 4s to 6s mostly fold and never raise, while deuces and 3s would? Well, one reason is that deuces and 3s would fold out 4s to 6s in the under the guns range, and folding out better is always great from an EV perspective. But also, it shows another way in which blockers matter. Unblocking folds. 4s, 5s and 6s block the under the guns players 4-5 suited, 5-6 suited and 6-7 suited, which would bet fold on the flop. And when we're bluffing, we don't want to block bet folds, as that decreases our chances of getting our bluff through. So besides thinking about which of your opponent's calling hands you block when trying to bluff, think about which of their folds you block. Or better, don't block. The turn would mostly be a bet, but the EV difference is again very small. Against a 50% pot bet, we still have a clear call, as in theory we can expect our opponent to have ace-x bluffs and low pocket pairs. And on the river, life isn't great, because there's no reason our opponent's line shouldn't include a bunch of straights and boats. But, as seen initially, our jack of spades does block value hands like king-jack suited and pocket jacks, which makes it a good hand to use for a bluff jam. However, maybe Marcos expected Linus to not be able to fold straights and trips here, which would be necessary, so he just called. In this case, Linus actually played his hand according to GTO. So his real self would be proud. So now let's look at the most common misconception, which can heavily improve your win rate, as it is about making calls in huge pots. Nacho opens 6-7 suited in the cutoff and gets called by Taisto in the big blind. On the 9-7-5 rainbow flops, he c-bets 75% pot. Here, a big bet is preferred in general, whether it's a size like this or an overbet. Betting big, but not often on these boards that do hit a good portion of the big blind's range, especially serves the cutoff's top pairs and lower over pairs. They get value from hands they are still ahead of, and also deny equity to hands like overcards or even gut shots that don't have a backdoor flush draw. And even a hand like 6-7 suited can get called by hands that it's ahead of, and at worst has many outs to improve in case it's behind. Facing a check raise, in theory, we could expect a range that basically includes all kinds of hand classes to some extent. Obviously not hands like straights, sets and 2-pair, and also thinner value hands like top pairs and low overpairs that could sometimes just call preflop. On mid stakes, people on average don't just call 10s and jacks often enough, by the way. So working with GTO preflop ranges to account for regulars on those stakes will be off. For a better overview of how population really plays, access my full preflop guide preflop exploits, which you can find in the link below. But also second and third pairs are in there. They block sets, 2-pair and sometimes even straights, like 6-7 for example, which at the same time also is a straight draw itself. And using it as a check raise has the benefit of folding out many 6-outers in the cutoffs range. Also, they serve well as bluffs on runouts where draws get there. And lastly, we see unmade hands that are mostly 8x, but also some 6x. And these heavily prefer having a backdoor flush draw. Against that range, 6-7 suited is a clear call. The turn overbet is also what the solver prefers. The big blind has a big nut advantage, as the cutoff would never have 8-6 or 6-4 here, because it's not in their preflop range. Also, the big blind has way more sets and 2-pair than the cutoff, so betting very big with these and adding enough bluffs to not allow the cutoff to just fold all his hands is the preferred strategy. For the same reason that they were check raised on the flop, good blockers, many outs, cleaning up equity and serving as unnatural bluffs, a lot of these bluffs still come from low pairs that come with a straight draw. Regarding the unmade hands bluffs, not all of them barrel. They are reduced to mainly those hands that draw to the best straights. And against that range, 6-7 is still a clear call. Here we can see that even Jack-8 and 10-8 could still call, as they don't only have straight draws, but also their 6 pair outs would be good against a big part of the big blind's range that we just saw. Now when thinking about what attributes your hand brings to the table, the one that usually comes up first is, we have good blockers, because we block pocket 7s, 6-8 and 6-4, which is true. But it's missing the other part of the equation. Here, the jam is only one of many bet sizes that the solver would use, but it is the most frequent one. So to demonstrate what's going on here, let's look at the scenario where only this bet size is used. Then we see 50% of Taisto's range would be betting, most top pairs and better, plus bluffs. Looking at the value betting range, we see that indeed pocket 7s, 6-8 suited and 6-4 suited are part of the big blind's range. But what many people miss is that we also need to look at the bluffs. And for the solver, the big blind's bluffs would never consist of air hands, but 100% of bluffs would be taken from pairs, mainly 7-4, 6-7, 6-5 and 6-3, which is a lot of sixes. So when your hand blocks a huge part of your opponent's bluffing range, it's not a good bluff catcher. Because if your opponent has no bluffs in their range, it doesn't matter how many nuts you block. You simply cannot call if you don't beat any hands. This is a part that is easy to overlook. In Solverland, 8x would never bluff the river here in Taisto's shoes. That's because on the river, Nacho himself would have Jack-8 suited, 10-8 suited, 7-8 suited and pocket 8s that would get to the river with a pretty high frequency. And all of them would be folds against the jam. So for Taisto, who as we learned doesn't want to block his opponent's folds when bluffing, it's better to not have an 8 when bluffing the river and instead use those hands mentioned before, 7-4, 6-7, 6-5 and 6-3. But of course, that is just the theory. Do I think Nacho didn't think about whether he blocks Taisto's bluffs? No, he's way too good for that. I think his thinking was at least 1, maybe 2 levels above that, and he was thinking about whether he blocks Taisto's bluffs or not. Because Nacho's call can still be profitable if he thinks Taisto's strategy differs a lot from the solver's. Obviously, if Taisto was overbluffing, 6-7 would quickly become a call. But also if Nacho had a reason to simply assume Taisto would be bluffing 8x hands and not too many 6x hands that have a pair and have more showdown value and therefore not use those as a bluff, then 6x is obviously a way better bluff catcher. Because in that case, you don't block any bluffs and mostly block value. Unfortunately, seeing a value hand like this doesn't give us any hint whether that was actually the case or not. That's just one of the many uncertainties we have to live with as a poker player. To learn how to deal with that uncertainty strategically and handle it better than your opponents, make sure you watch this video next.